This is episode 12 of Old Man Yells, and I'm Bob Burnett from Barefoot Mining. Today's topic is zombies. Now, you might not have expected that to be today's topic, but I'm going to start by talking about a scene from one of my favorite movies, which is called World War Z, starring Brad Pitt. And in this movie, Brad Pitt plays a character called Jerry Lane, and Jerry's a UN investigator. Zombies have overwhelmed all the major cities of the world. It's spreading like wildfire. Nobody knows how to control this virus. And he has been charted with stopping this thing, figuring out how it started and how to beat it. But it turns out actually there is one place where the virus hasn't overwhelmed, and that is Jerusalem. And it turns out that very early on, Jerusalem built this massive wall around the entire city, locking out all of the zombies. So Brad Pitt decides to go to Jerusalem to see how they knew and if they might be able to help. So upon arriving, he meets a character named Jürgen Wormbrunner, who is in the Mossad. And he asks him, how did you know to build the wall? And this is Jürgen's response. He says, most people don't believe something can happen until it does. And that's not sloppiness or stupidity or weakness. It's just human nature. And then he goes on to explain that they intercepted a message from an Indian officer saying that they were fighting the undead. It's kind of weird, strange, off-kilter message that I think in most cases people would disregard. And so Lane says, well, why would you build a wall based around one zombie message from India? And Jürgen responds, he said, well, hey, in the 30s, the German Jews refused to believe they could be sent to concentration camps, but clearly they could. And in 1972, also in Germany at the Munich Olympics, the government refused to believe that their athletes could be massacred on site at the Olympics, but it turns out they could. If you're not familiar with that incident, Google the Munich massacre of Israeli athletes. A month later, they saw the year later, in September of 73, they saw all these massive troop movements around the area, Arab troop movements, and yet they ignored them only to be overwhelmed by an attack a month later, where they were driven almost to the sea before rebounding and winning that war. So in response to these sorts of events, the Israeli government said, we're going to institute something new. It's called the 10th man. And the 10th man works by saying, if 9 people in the intelligence community are presented with the same information and reach the same conclusion, it is the duty of the 10th man to disagree. No matter how improbable or unlikely that scenario might be, they must start from the assumption that the other 9 are wrong. Now, in this story, Jürgen was the 10th man, and he responded to the zombie message from India in such a compelling manner that he was able to convince the rest of the people that the threat was existential, and that by not responding to it, it was potentially the end of their society. And so he convinced them to build the wall, and at least for a while prevented the zombies from taking over Jerusalem. Now, in the past week, unfortunately and devastatingly, a surprise attack by Hamas caught the Israelis off guard and resulted in a whole bunch of people dying and a lot of chaos. I'm not taking a political side there, although clearly that's a horrible act. But what I am here today to talk about is the fact that they were surprised by this attack. Now, in reality in Israel, from my poking around, I don't believe the 10th man exists in the form in which it's portrayed in the movie. But I have found evidence of something called the Red Team, which is a group within the intelligence community, which does act in much the same manner by always questioning whatever the conventional policy path is, security path, and trying to poke holes at it or provide alternatives. Now, you might say, well, why, Bob? What's the difference between a 10th man and a devil's advocate? Everybody's probably played devil's advocate at some point. But I would propose that there is a material difference. A devil's advocate is really just asking a few questions, typically, maybe throwing a concern. In this case, 10th man, though, is taking a passionate position, putting a concerted effort into justifying that position, and then promoting a counter argument to try to convince others that they're on the wrong path and you're on the right one. Now, in recent history, especially in the Bitcoin world, I think there have been some cases, most notably around like the BlockFi and FTX situations, where there were some voices of reason within the community that put forth some pretty compelling arguments, worrying about things like rehypothecation or worrying about whether or not exchanges actually had the Bitcoin that they said that they had. And these 10th men and women put forth an argument at least compelling enough to have some people take appropriate action and get out of those relationships. Unfortunately, the masses did not, and the catastrophe that resulted is history. Now, not everything in life requires a 10th man type analysis, but things like security and politics, money, war, health, maybe future technology, all those sort of things probably are worthy of it. Now, sometimes a topic will be such that you don't really need a 10th man because the topic itself creates a division with two material factions. There might be one that's a majority, but even the minority one still is large enough and vocal enough. Right now, you can see that, let's say, in COVID vaccines, in climate change, in artificial intelligence, all those sort of things have two factions that are material. And while there is definitely a predominant thread within society favoring one over the other still has a prominent voice. Now, when we look at when do we really need a 10th man, I think part of it is when you see things like all experts agree or everything is working well. That's probably when we're at the greatest danger. And part of that comes from the fact that when we get in those sort of situations, I think people start to let their guard down. They start to become complacent. They start to feel comfortable. And if you talk to a security expert, whether that's physical security or virtual security, that's really when you get exposed. Using the same password over and over again, not using a VPN, not locking your doors because nobody in the neighborhood has ever been broken into. Those sort of things have led to very bad endings for people that fell into that trap of being comfortable, of trusting. We think of the history of real 10th men. I think one that comes to mind is Copernicus. So Copernicus is the father of the heliocentric view of the universe, that prior to Copernicus, all the modern thinkers looked at the Earth as the center of the universe and everything revolving around the Earth. And his proposal that no, we were heliocentric, meaning we revolved around the sun, was heresy, essentially. And he was the first person to really start putting compelling arguments forth into the world that there was a different way to do it. Now, had that happened, you could argue that had that not happened, that he had not had the courage and the foresight to challenge the conventional thinking and put forth the alternative, obviously we're never going to travel to the stars, and all kinds of technology would have been greatly inhibited. In modern times, though, I would argue that the greatest act of someone being a 10th man would be Satoshi Nakamoto. That this was a lone voice, somebody solving a problem, the Byzantine general problem, thought to be unsolvable, and pairing it in such a manner as to threaten and challenge the very financial and monetary establishment of the world, and then by extension, the whole power structure of the world. I think we can thank Satoshi for having that courage to put it forth and grow it and mature it to that point. Without it, I'm certainly not here talking on this show, and you're not listening. Now, I believe Bitcoin is money for 1,000 years. That's a hard concept. You think about the geopolitics of the world 1,000 years ago, completely different. Country boundaries, political systems, technology systems, all that are completely different. So given that we're in the first little fraction of that 1,000-year history, who knows what sort of things we're going to cross and encounter as we move forward into the future. I'm unfortunately going to see a very brief period of it, as is anybody listening. Nobody here is going to see the end game, at least I don't believe so. We're going to suffer from a lot of attacks. Now, we've been through a bear market recently, and I think most of us have kind of been on edge, that we're kind of prepared for attacks. Our defenses are up because of the bear market. Part of the reason I'm giving this message today was, one, prompted by what happened in Israel with the Hamas attack. But secondly, I feel, maybe I'm wrong, but I feel like we're on the cusp of exiting the bear market. And thank God for that. It's been a long road. But as we enter the bull market, we should be aware that that euphoria, the high that we're going to get from the bull market, may put our defenses down. We might start getting comfortable. We might start seeing more world governments support us. We might see big financial institutions support the cause, and start to feel more and more comfortable that the days of large threats, existential threats threatening Bitcoin are dissipating. And going back to what I said before, that's when the security experts would say, well, now be careful, because that is the condition in which you get whacked. So I'll close today by just saying, I've tried to be a 10th man. I've had this concept. Some of you that know me may have heard me talk about it personally over the last few years. It's why I wrote articles like Satoshi's Heel about some potential threats of mining centralization, very small threats in any one window of time, but maybe a decent threat over a 1,000-year period. It's why the 3 most recent episodes of Old Man Yells were about the public mining companies and some of the threats that have resulted from those companies having such an maybe important position or large position within our industry, within our community. So I'll close by saying, as we move forward, think about where you can be a 10th man. We are going to need an army of 10th men and women, big thinkers, looking outside the box, with the courage, the confidence, conviction to go against the grain and speak up against the conventional wisdom. So this is really important. We have to have these people. Some of them might be technical, fighting against maybe a BIP. Some of them might be speaking up against big financial institutions as they try to push for a change or some sort of regulation that isn't in the best interest of Bitcoin. Some of it may come from the mining industry that I'm in, where we see centralization forces rearing their heads at the miner level, at the pool level, or in some other fashion. We need people to speak forth. But the second piece, and equally important, is we have to have a community that's willing to listen. Doesn't mean you have to agree. The nature of 10th men is such that they're often going to be wrong. Not everything is a conspiracy. Not everything is a threat. But you have to look at these things with an open mind, give them serious consideration before you and give them serious consideration before you discard them. So that's really my challenge to everybody today. And maybe the lesson is, have the courage to be a 10th man, where within your wheelhouse, you can provide that expertise. And when you're not, keep your ears open for others that might be advocating for one of those positions. We're fighting for something big, the future of money, the future of freedom, the very power structure of the world. And it's not going to be an easy road. So let's all be prepared, and let's embrace this 10th man concept.